you. So I would like to welcome you very warmly on this sixth webinar in the series, which is this time on impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on employment, potential solutions for informal and self-employed workers. And my name is Christina Behrendt. I'm from the ILO. And I think this webinar is a very important one in the series. As we have seen in many contexts and many countries, I mean almost all of them probably, that this crisis has really exposed in a very dramatic way gaps in social protection for informal and self-employed workers. And this is really true for countries in all levels of development. And it also demonstrates the vulnerability of everyone and the need for universal social protection. And today we're looking specifically at self-employed and informal workers. And I'm very happy to be here also with three others very knowledgeable and very nice colleagues. So Portia Kekana from South Africa, Laura Alfers also from South Africa, and Carmen Roca from Peru. I'm going to introduce them in a bit of more extensive way later on. But first of that, I would really like to welcome you, all of you, and I would like to introduce the series and the initiative. And so this is the sixth webinar of the series of social protection responses to the COVID-19 webinar series. And this series is a joint effort initiated by the IPC, IG, GIZ on behalf of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation, Australia's government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and in collaboration with the Social Protection.org platform and in cooperation with partners from different organizations. And this webinar series is part of an initiative with two other major components, and you'll find the links in the comments bar. So one is a collaborative mapping of country news and documents, which is disseminated weekly through a dedicated newsletter and an online community on the topic to really just systematize information and foster discussion. And so you can see their information, how you can join the online community. And obviously, this is also linked to current and future webinars. And I'm going to introduce you to the next one. Already to announce that the next one is on 28th of April. On the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on formal sector workers, and looking specifically at potential social protection and employment responses. So please don't forget to register for that webinar. I think it will be a very interesting one, and I think it's very much also complementary to the discussion that we have today. So let me introduce the other speakers. And so if we can just move to the next one. Let me start with Laura Alfers, who is no stranger to that discussion, certainly. And Laura is the director of the social protection program of WIGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And she has done lots of work on that, and I'm sure that most of you have already read some of her work on that. So the next one on the list, just see who's the next one, is Carmen, also with WIGO, but based in Peru, in Lima. And so Carmen has been working for the International Development Research Center previously in Canada for almost 10 years on issues of social economic policy, and was Deputy Director of the Consorcio de Investigación Económica y Social in Peru until 2019. Excuse my Spanish. And she has been working a lot on social protection for the working poor, especially. And last but not least, Portia is also based in South Africa, and who is with the Department of Small Business Development in the government of South Africa, and has lots of experience also in other organizations such as NEDLAC. And she's also an accredited master trainer for Transform. So that is really nice. So with lots of experience also in social protection. Okay, so after, yeah, maybe I should introduce myself as well. My name is Christina Behrendt. I'm the head of the social policy unit in the ILO's social protection department. And I've been working quite a lot also on different aspects of social protection in various contexts. So before introducing the topic, let me just also share with you, and those of you who have followed the previous webinars, you know that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the session. So please send in your questions in the chat bar, and please also interact with us on Twitter, and you have all the hashtags there. And I really do hope that we get lots of interesting questions. In case we should not have the time really to reply to all of us in the session, there will also be the possibility that we could reply to some of them in writing then after the session, which will then be placed on the website as well. So please do send in your questions, and we do our best to really respond to them. And so you can also join the social protection responses to COVID-19 task force, the online community, and can participate in the follow-up discussions about the webinar. So so let me just to start off the discussion. I would like to just share with you a little bit of information and some questions and some aspects to really set the scene and introduce then also some of the questions which will be addressed by Laura, Carmen, and Portia afterwards. And I would like to start with a graph. If you can move to the next slide. And this is actually a graph that shows the share of the global workforce affected by mandatory or recommended closures. And in fact, at the moment, it's 81% of the global workforce lives in countries with mandatory or recommended closures. That affects more than 3.9 billion people. I mean, not all of them are affected in the same way, obviously, but this is really it has really a very kind of almost universal effect on everyone, but it plays out in different ways. I mean, some people like ourselves, I think we're quite comfortable in our homes, teleworking, using the computers, and be able to continue our work. But this is not a reality for most informal workers. I mean, for them, teleworking is in most cases not an option. Working from home is not an option. So for them, it's really the question of are they able really to continue earning an income? Are they able to access healthcare? Are they able to put food on the table? So this is really, for many of them, very essential choices. And most of the informal workers don't have any possibility of having an income replacement. In many cases, no savings. Many of them are being threatened for losing their livelihoods. And also in many contexts, also especially for people who are active in public spaces, like, for example, street vendors, it's also a question of the way how the authorities enforce the lockdown measures. and the question of the police not letting people work. And obviously there is a big concern about the health risks, but I think at the same time we need to be very concerned also about the risks for people's incomes and livelihoods. And so actually, if you can move to the next slide, this crisis now represents really the most severe crisis since World War II, and most of you will have seen the estimates for the global recession coming out of the IMF last week. The ILO has tried to estimate the impact on unemployment, and I think what we see here is really quite a conservative estimate. So what the ILO has come out with is that this crisis could actually reduce the employment to the extent between kind of 190 and 2030 equivalents of full-time work. But with all the insecurities that we have about that question, so I think it might even in many contexts be even more dramatic than that. And if we can move to the next slide. So if we look at the how informal work is being affected by that, I mean, simply in terms of looking at the numbers and looking at how many people are impacted by these measures and by the repercussions of that crisis. I mean, we see that especially in countries with a very large informal employment, like India, but also we see here China, Vietnam, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, some of which have put in place very stringent measures, such as India and Pakistan. Others, the measures are, at least for the time being, not as stringent as that. And how these measures are being implemented and are having an impact on informal workers. I mean, some of the sectors are particularly affected, especially, I mean, I've already mentioned, for example, street vendors, waste recyclers, transport workers in many contexts, construction workers, domestic workers, farmers producing for urban markets. So these has all had a very dramatic effect on many workers. Also, for many of them being compelled or sometimes forced to return to their home villages while the transport options were not there. So, I mean, from what we hear, this is really having a very strong impact. And given also that our discussion, well, I think it will concentrate mostly on low and middle income countries, but also, I mean, we have also seen in high income countries that a lot of those who are self-employed or even those who are working in sometimes quite precarious conditions, such as delivery workers, have been affected also very strongly, and very in many countries also people working as artists or people working in culture. So I think the realities are quite diverse, but we see that the social protection gaps which pre-existed for those groups of workers are really now hitting in very strongly, and in a very dramatic way in many cases. So if we can go to the next slide. So just to give you a very broad overview just putting three main kind of indicators on the table for the different world regions. So, and this is again an estimate from the ILO. The share of employment in at-risk sectors, which in many countries is between kind of 30 and 40% of the labor force. And in Africa, it's slightly less, but I think this is also, I mean, we'll have to see how the situation evolves also in Africa. The very high levels of informality in many countries, and you see also when we look at the link and the relationship with social protection coverage, that high informality is usually associated with very low levels of social protection coverage. So there's a very close relationship there, and obviously this shows us that there have been already previous to that crisis very strong gaps in protection for informal and self-employed workers, but now it's very much even more exacerbated. So I'm just very conscious about the time. So let me maybe, because let me maybe skip some slides and move to the one which is kind of entitled Menu of Options. So let me just no, next one, even one more. Okay, so this is, and those of you who have been following the series of webinars, you have already seen it. Actually, that slide is borrowed from Valentina Barker's presentation from the first webinar. And I think it shows in a very concise way some of the very practical challenges that we see in designing and implementing social protection solutions for self-employed workers and workers in the informal economy. What you see here on the left-hand side is and this is what you see here in blue, mostly in blue and in gray. These are, I mean, reaching those who are already registered in programs. It doesn't necessarily mean that they already receive benefits, but they are registered in some way or another. And for those people, and this is really also where existing mechanisms of social protection really play out in a very positive way. In these contexts, it's relatively easy to increase benefit levels, to provide benefits for those who are registered in those schemes. And this can include both the social insurance, it can include universal transfers, also such as the social pensions, and it can include existing social assistance programs like cash transfer programs. So there, the challenge of registration and enrollment and outreach is relatively positive. I mean, so it's possible to extend those measures. But the big challenge, and this is actually the case for many of those who are currently in the informal economy, the big challenge is that many of those, and this is exactly the definition of informal economy, that they are not covered. They're not registered under any of the existing mechanisms. And here many countries really face very big difficulties to reach out to those workers, to put in place mechanisms that can actually provide a meaningful protection for them. And what we see there is that many countries, although many of them have put in place measures urgently, but many of them are really struggling with reaching out to those workers, and be sure that the benefits provided to them are really meaningful and meet their needs. I think one critical point is really in that also engaging with the informal workers themselves, ensuring that they participate in the search for solutions. And I think this is something that then especially Laura and Carmen, and I think also Portia are going to talk about. So if we can now move to the last, no, again, one more. So, and for those of you who have looked at the description of the seminar, there were 3 main questions being asked, and this is really what the following panelists are going to focus on in a much in a very illustrative and very clear way. It's really to see which of the categories of informal workers and the self-employed are being impacted by the crisis, and how, and what are their specific needs now and in the future, and how they can best be reached. And what are the social protection responses that are particularly promising in that context? What are the possible drawbacks? And then also to see how they can be actively involved in the quest for effective solutions, because this is really critical. Make sure that those measures are actually effective. And I would just like to add some further questions that kind of somehow cut across, because and I think this is something that we might be able to pick up at the end and in the discussion. It's really also, given that the current crisis has exposed the previous coverage gaps, I think the question is not so much kind of how can we get back to what we had before, but the question is how can we build better systems. And so the question is, how can these short-term measures be designed in a way that they can contribute to more equitable and sustainable solutions for the future? How can they be anchored in a rights-based framework and don't leave anyone behind? And really, what are the lessons learned for the future with regard to building those social protection systems, including social protection force that make sure that we can actually reach universal protection for everyone. And universal protection, not just in the sense that everyone is covered, but also ensuring that we talk about adequate protection, so that it's not only the very kind of basic levels, but that we make sure that the protection that is provided is really adequate, is comprehensive, and it really helps people in their daily lives. So, and I think I'll stop here, and I'll hand over to Laura for her presentation. Yeah, you have some resources are listed there, and I think the presentation is going to be shared with you then afterwards as well. Yes, Laura, if you like to start.
Thanks, Christina. I'll move straight along to the next slide. Thanks. So one of the first responses of WeGo when it was clear that the COVID crisis would be impacting on the global south as well was to reach out to our constituent members of informal workers, many of whom represent and work with informal workers who are self-employed and are in particularly vulnerable occupations which are dominated by women. So we reached out to networks in the street vending sector and market trading sector, in domestic workers. Domestic workers are not self-employed workers, but they are a very vulnerable group of informal workers who work in households, home-based workers, as well as waste pickers, waste recyclers. And we interviewed 33 people, a mix of WeGo team who work closely with informal workers, but also informal worker leaders themselves. Self-employed workers make up over 70% of workers in low-income countries. And I think we wanted to make the point, very often it's sort of binary between the formal economy and the impact on the informal economy, or the impact on waged workers and the impact on the self-employed. And those are very lumpy categories. And I think we wanted to make the point that the way the public health regulations that have come down around COVID-19 are impacting informal workers, self-employed workers, actually differs according to the type of occupations in which they're located. And so that is why we took that sectoral focus. Nevertheless, there were a number of commonalities that we were able to identify about the pathways through which incomes amongst the self-employed were being impacted. The first was obviously an inability to access markets, largely because of controls on movement. So hearing about small farmers in India who are unable to get their produce into the city to be sold. Also ban on work in public space. So street traders who are not selling essential goods, waste reclaimers in South Africa, for example, have not been considered essential workers. So they have actually been banned from working in public spaces. The second one is a decrease in demand. So home-based workers who make craft products in Thailand, the tourism industry has completely fallen off. There's less demand for their products. There's no demand for their products. Domestic workers are affected in a slightly different way. They have been laid off by employers who are either afraid of, bringing people into their houses and creating new chains of infection, or because employers are, because employers are being retrenched themselves and cannot and aren't taking on extra costs. So that's just to give an idea of some of the different ways in which different groups of workers are being impacted. I think that one of the key findings, though, was that in many places, certain groups of informal workers are being declared as essential workers, and particularly food vendors. In many African cities, food vendors have been declared essential workers, and in Peru, newspaper vendors have also been declared essential workers. So in one respect, they are, more fortunate in that they are able to continue working, but at the same time, they're facing increasing costs of their inputs. So, for example, we heard of a newspaper vendor in Peru she is now no longer allowed to sell on the sidewalk. She has to sell her newspapers door to door. But because there are such severe constraints on transport, she is having to pay for private taxis to move around the city. So that obviously is increasing her costs. And also informal workers are generally being expected to bear the costs of protective equipment on their own. So they're having to invest in the masks and the gloves and the anything that they feel they need to protect themselves. So that is adding to their costs. Also, for some of these workers who are essential workers, has been an increased care burden. That's particularly where schools have closed. So, and that tends to impact women workers harder, because they are the ones who generally take on most of the responsibility for care. So, and that is, they're having to bring children to work, or they are being distracted at work by children that they're having to, doing some. I think a lot of us are learning about how hard it is to do childcare and work at the same time. And Karini should be sharing the full rapid assessment in the chat box, so you'll be able to download that from the WeGo website. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So some of the key policy implications and perhaps the key messages that came out of the study as a whole. The first one is that informal workers, and particularly the self-employed, are not homogenous. There are going to be different impacts according to gender, place of work, occupation, age, and that is going to impact the way that policies need to be designed to support these workers, particularly, for example, around rebuilding market relationships. If we're thinking about livelihood recovery, that's going to look very different for a domestic worker than it is for a street vendor. In terms of social protection, it might have an impact on how we think about financing social protection beyond an emergency grant. So, for example, home workers in global supply chains have been talking about, shouldn't we be arguing that global brands need to create a social security fund that can help finance social protection for us until there is recovery in those supply chains. I think another point that has become very clear is that social protection now, and particularly in the form of social assistance that can get out to workers quickly, is vital to their survival. Many informal workers are not able to work at the moment, and they don't have any access to social protection, and it's coming down to the level of not having enough food to eat for many of these workers. I think another key issue that came out of our finding was that the very real worry from informal workers that the impacts are not going to be short-term, that their livelihoods are going to be disrupted probably for years and may never return. So particularly if we think about tourism in Southeast Asia, many market traders, transport workers, home-based workers rely on the tourism industry, and I mean that is going to take quite a while to recover. So I think we need to be, as much as the short-term social protection interventions are important, I guess to emphasize Christina's point that we need to be thinking about what this means for the long term as well. And then another really key point is that one thing we are seeing is that at the same time that governments are talking about extending social protection to workers, we're seeing this being used as an excuse to actually destroy informal livelihoods at the same time. So waste pickers in Colombia, for example, many of them have been able to access a grant, but they're refusing to leave the streets because they're concerned that by leaving the streets, this will allow private companies so they're cooperatives of waste pickers who have won contracts from municipalities to recycle. They're concerned that if they leave the streets, those contracts are going to go to private sector companies who have been competing for the contracts. We've seen in India the destruction of street vending infrastructure in Ahmedabad. Local governments using this as an excuse to destroy infrastructure that informal workers have fought hard to have erected to support their street vending. So I think this idea of doing no harm to existing livelihoods is particularly important, and I think it needs to be linked to the social protection argument. It cannot end with cash and food. You can't be giving social protection out and then destroying people's means to continue earning an income once restrictions have been lifted. And I think that the same message there is about protecting and enhancing the market position of informal workers. And I think it's important to see social protection and livelihood recovery together, because otherwise we stop at social protection and we're missing out a very vital component of the longer term picture. Thanks. Next slide. So what is amazing at the moment is an unprecedented increase in the number of social assistance schemes that are reaching out to informal workers. If anybody is following the World Bank updates, I mean, it's been incredible to us. Informal workers have almost never been the targets of, the cash grants or the social assistance schemes. And suddenly we're seeing governments attempting to reach the missing middle. So it seems like a real moment to advance the extension of non-contributory forms of social protection to vulnerable workers. So what I've tried to do here is just provide a summary of some of the things that we are seeing, some of the ways that governments are trying to reach informal workers. Next slide. One of the options is a universal income grant. So, for example, Hong Kong is one place that has done this. So everybody, gets a certain amount of cash. It's usually done as a once-off payment. It eradicates all the complex targeting issues with trying to find these informal workers, which we've never looked for before. No exclusion errors. Of course, the disadvantage is that it's usually considered expensive by governments and may not be politically feasible. I know that many people who have been working on the advocacy side say, well, we just can't say the word universal basic income because it immediately takes it off the table. The second approach is targeting out. So this is where governments are attempting to target out, reach informal workers by targeting out everybody who is not an informal worker. So those people covered by social security and social assistance beneficiaries, usually leveraging off national ID systems. Often there's an on-demand registration. Two examples of this are Thailand and Namibia. So for example, in Namibia, you can sign up with your cell phone. There's a 5-minute questionnaire, and that will go through, and your ID will be verified. If you're not a member of the social security scheme, you're not a member, you're not receiving a social assistance, and you're not a student, then you will qualify for the grant. So it's a simpler and perhaps less exclusion areas than the targeting in approach, which I'll talk about next. Again, it is often considered expensive because you're still trying to reach a large amount of people. And in Thailand, we have heard that the system was completely overwhelmed. So originally the government were trying to reach 3 million people, and 22 million people registered. And so now there's a sort of triage system in place, trying to work out who actually needs the money most. There can be issues with the most vulnerable workers less likely to have an ID. There is also an issue here with the potential, of targeting out vulnerable workers in the formal sector. So this depends on how the targeting out is done. Obviously, if it's only social security, people beneficiaries of social security, maybe that's okay, but it also depends on what that social security scheme looks like. So it's not as clear cut in this case. Another option is targeting in, so trying to find the informal workers, and there are many examples of this: Peru, Colombia, Zimbabwe, Argentina, and a lot of this depends on what the country has in place already. So in some cases, we're seeing informal worker organizations being asked to put together databases to send to governments. In other cases, there is some existing social registry, such as in Latin America, on which governments can draw. One other one that comes up is this issue of employer responsibility, and this is especially true, and it's not one we see too much of in the social systems discussions, and it's especially informal workers in the formal sector and in households. So if you look at the demands that the International Domestic Workers Federation has put out for social protection, it actually doesn't ask for anything from the state. What they want is paid leave from their employers. And they are working with employer associations around that. So a lot of the Latin American organizations are trying to put pressure on employer associations. In South Africa as well, for example, there have been arguments that, there's going to be a support fund for small and medium enterprises, small, micro and medium enterprises. There should be a qualification for that their workers must be paid in order to qualify for those benefits. So that is also an option that I wanted to put on the table. I see that I am nearly out of time, so I'm going to skip to the next slide quickly. And just to say that this slide just gives a bit more details about some of the options for targeting in that we've seen, and I won't go into them, but they are there on the slide, and we can come back to them. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end with some key messages. I think the best way to reach informal workers at the moment is through the more universal approaches. So either the universal income or the targeting out approach. The objection to those is around financing, and that can be understandable. Finances are tight at the moment. But I do just want to make a plea that we also can think about creative ways. That governments need to think creatively about financing as well. In South Africa, for example, there have been proposals to use the surplus from the Unemployment Insurance Fund to supplement the grants. Again, global brands perhaps contributing to a social security fund for home workers and global supply chains. So not to close off the financing discussion too easily. I think it's a second important message is about the inclusion of organizations of informal workers. and that it is important to work with and include them in what is happening. Where informal workers have been included, it's usually in processes around social security or social insurance. And I think the social assistance world might need to reach out to the work-related social security world and try and find where those spaces are, and make sure that when we talk about leveraging existing systems, we're also leveraging the existing policy spaces in which informal workers have already been included. And I think working with informal workers, you know, many governments are saying, give us your databases of members, and I think that's great. But there are other ways to work with informal workers organizations. Oversight of schemes, for example, might be one of them, including them in a multi-stakeholder group. Communications to the grassroots and outreach, you know, support with registration, all of those things are places where the grassroots can usually work faster than the state, and it's important to remember that. And then just two final points. I think for many informal workers, it's going to how they receive the benefits. I think choice is going to be an important part of that. A lot of emphasis has been put on mobile money. I think that's great, and it's very interesting to see these developments happening. But I don't think it should end there, and I think that there need to be multiple ways in which people can receive their benefits. And then just finally, again, the emergency assistance is absolutely vital. But just to echo Christina's point, that thinking long term is going to be important as well. Thank you. I will end there.
Christina, we can hear you. Can you please unmute? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself. This is the kind of the classical mistake in all these webinars. No, I just wanted to thank really Lara for the very insightful presentation and the very key points that you put on the table. And I'm sure we're going to have a discussion then later on that. But now I would like to hand over to Carmen to talk to us and to explain the situation in Peru and also in the broader context, I think also within Latin America. So please go ahead, Carmen.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias from Lima in Peru. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a specific measure that was taken here for the independent workers, considering them informal workers. So at the beginning, we just have a bit introduction data to give some context. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so some background information. Our country is a country of 32 million people. A third of those live in Lima. So Lima holds a third of the population of Peru, 10 million people, or a bit more, but it holds half of the GDP of the country. So everything is very, very, very concentrated, centralized in Lima. Our economy pre-COVID was stagnant for the last 3 years. And just a note about informal workers, they're mostly migrants of first or second generation who come from the Andes, indigenous people from the Andes, sometimes the Amazon areas. In terms of COVID cases for Peru, as of yesterday's data, 16,000 cases and more than 400 deaths. Next slide. So this is just to explain a little bit why everything is so centralized and why it is so difficult to get any kind of program from the government to the Andes and the Amazon area. If you look at the first two maps to your left, they tell you, the first one, the different regions of Peru. The second one tells you the natural regions of Peru. So the yellow is the coast, the brown is the Andes. So you only see mountains if you look at the map from above. And then you see all the the jungle, the selva, which is all the Amazon area. And at the end, there's a satellite picture that shows you how little the coast is, that yellow line. But most of the people are migrating from the Andes and from the Amazon area to Lima or to cities in the coast to have access to work, to better living conditions, to a modern kind of life. This is just context. Next slide. Okay, so informal employment in Peru, in terms of total employment, 73% is informal employment. In Lima, it's 57%. If we just look at non-agricultural employment, the total in Peru is 65%. And in Lima, it's again the same figure of 57%, because in Lima, we don't have any kind of agricultural activities. Next slide. So if we want to look at how the informal employment is distributed, we have here an idea. The first line is people who receive some kind of wage, even if it's a daily payment or payment by week, or even if it's just tips or whatever kind of thing that we can consider a salary, it's 29%. And here is where we have the youngest population. People start their lives, their working lives, working as wage workers, probably in very small enterprises or micro enterprises. The next segment is the independent workers, the self-employed that are not employers. And here we have a figure of 27, but we consider plus 5 percentage points. Why? Because these are people who at some point in their lives, they're registered with a tax office to get a tax ID number, but they didn't pay their taxes, and their profile, their social and economic profile, is exactly the same as that of an independent worker in informal employment. But now they are read in the statistics as formal workers because they were registered at some point with the tax office. So usually we consider that 5% in formal independent. We put it together with the informal independent. And that brings the segment of the independent workers in informal employment to be the largest segment in employment in Peru. And it has been so for the last ever years, because we had solid, consistent 12 years of economic growth in the late 2000s and on. And even with that economic growth that decreased informal employment in Peru from levels of 86% to 73% nowadays, that segment always stayed the same in percentile points. And you'll see why in a little bit. Then we have a little portion of unpaid family workers, domestic workers, decreased in proportion of the workforce with the years of financial growth, and a very small percentage of employers. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a picture of a march that we had last year supporting the non-eviction from an area in Lima. And you can see the profile of the people who are street vendors here in an area of Lima. You see more women, you see migrant people, etc. So next slide. So this is the profile of just the independent in informal employment. You see more women in reproductive age. You see more people who are over 60 years old of age. It's the lowest level of education of the whole workforce. They are moving between quintiles 1 and 2 of income and expense. You see more people living in poverty, and it's the most precarious living and working conditions of all the workforce. Next slide. Okay, so this is very quickly, I wanted you to see how our health system was divided, and this is how the COVID virus found us, so that we understand the following information I'm going to give you. Very quickly, we had a health system, that's the social security system, which is for people who are working, and through payroll, they are paying to their social security health system. We have all the hospitals, the network of the Ministry of Health. We have a private insurance segment for insurance of people. Next slide. We have a municipal system of hospitals that are sort of first aid or first kind of protection. And then we have all the hospitals that belong to police, army, aviation, etc. Next slide, please. So imagine all those systems work separately. What we have that is very important to mention here in Peru is the CIS, which is the integral or it's the health system to cover the poor. This system does not provide additional supply of hospitals, care, health posts close to where you live, anything. It's just a financing mechanism. So if I'm a person who has very little income, I can be insured by CIS, and therefore I can go to a hospital and not pay anything. Medicines should be given to me for free. However, because no additional supply was produced, this system created a lot of additional demand, and as a result, we have even longer lineups than we had before. We have a limited number of patients per day that can be cared for who are insured by CIS. In a hospital would say, okay, we'll get up to 15 people today from CIS. The rest are the people who pay. There's a wide lack of medicines. They give you maybe Tylenol and they ask you to buy the real medicines outside of the hospital, etc. Next slide. So I explained that so that you could understand how the people in Peru are covered in health terms. So close to half of the population of the non-agricultural informal workforce, almost half of them have CIS. So that means they're covered somehow. Then we have 12% who are covered by the social security system related to work. And why is this? Because if I work, maybe I can provide coverage to my children. So they can have Salud, which is the social security health system. And then private and the others from the police and the army are very small. Next slide. Okay, so what are the measures that have been taken here in Peru in the COVID context to cover informal workers? The first measure was not having in target that it was for people who are independent informal workers. No, it was thinking of people who live in poverty and extreme poverty according to a directory that we have, which was produced in a joint effort by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Social Development. That directory went through the country and swept households first in the rural areas, looking for the very poor and the poor households. And then it went to urban areas. So it has some deficiencies when you look at the data from the cities, the urban areas. But we are sure that in the rural areas, the directory is very precise because it was like a census going household to household to note which household was poor, which household was living in extreme poverty. So the first measure is a cash grant, the equivalent of $110 for the household. And then later, after this announcement was made, maybe a week after it or 10 days after it, with a lot of pressure that we put on the media and on social networks, etc., for considering independent workers, this came out. It was announced as a grant for independent workers who, by that directory that I mentioned before, are not considered poor, are not considered extreme poor households. They come after that, they come as read as not poor. So this was supposed to cover close to 800,000 households. It's the same amount paid to the people who live in poverty. Next slide. Okay, so this was our proposal in terms of how to build the list of the people who would get this grant for informal workers. So our suggestion was first that there could be voluntary registry in a mechanism that we have with the tax office, which is called NRUS for new RUS. It's a registry, a simplified registry for people, and it's meant to be for independent informal workers. It has a very low tax rate. The equivalent would be $6 per month, or you pay zero tax if you are selling food items perishable around markets, if you're a street vendor. Local governments have lists of all the street vendors, market vendors, newspaper vendors, shoe shiners who work in their geographic ambit. They provide licenses, the workers pay for those licenses, so they definitely have an official list of all the people who acquired a license. There is also a registry in every municipality of associations that are alive and kicking in their area. All associations register with their municipality, different kinds. The workers come together in associations, in trade unions, in federations, and they always register those with the public registry, so it's notarized and it's part of the state system that your association is registered somewhere with government, and it says who's the president, who's the deputy, who's the person in charge of keeping the minutes, who's the person in charge of organization. The whole steering committee of your association is listed, and it says when you had the election and all of that. So to our eyes, that's also official data. There's also the registry of all trade unions, being formal or informal, with the Ministry of Labor. And finally, we said vendors have proof of the daily fees that they pay to municipalities for being on the streets. Usually every day at some time in the morning, somebody comes from the municipality and collects cash fees from the street vendors for their right to be where they are. Next slide, please. So none of these suggestions was taken, we were told, because it was not official data, in the sense that it was not data created by the state, and that it was not data that, if not generated by the state, was not ratified by the state. In the sense of, for example, a municipality has a list of associations of waste pickers that are working with them in the program of collecting recyclable materials from neighbors in the municipality. That list is at the municipality, but I was told if the municipality has never issued a decree where it says that it has this listing of waste pickers, it's not official data. So that was a problem. So how did the cash grant, which was called here in Peru, Bono Independiente, and itself, it's a recognition of the importance and vulnerability of independent informal workers in the country. So you can see at the bottom of the picture, first, the workers could not be beneficiaries of other social programs that are running in government in normal conditions, which is the normal cash grant program and the non-contributory pension programs. Those are called Juntos, the cash program, and Pension 65, the non-contributory pension. So the entity from state who was in charge of verifying that data with the list of proposed beneficiaries was the Ministry of Social Development. Next. Another condition that the beneficiary had to fulfill was that nobody in the household had to be working for the state or for private enterprises, so would not appear on any payroll list of government or private sector. And this was verified by the Ministry of Labor. Next slide. Then again, the potential beneficiary, the household, was actually the beneficiary. So nobody in the household should earn more than $330 per month. And this was in charge of verification by the tax office and by the supervisory entity that we have for the whole banking system. So you see a lot of state institutions came together to arrive to a final list of the households that could receive this bonus, this cash. Next slide. Another condition, nobody in the home has a contract with the state. So you cannot be working for any municipality, any ministry, anything that has to do with the state, you cannot have a contract with them because maybe you are not on their payroll, but you have a contract. And this was referenced, verified with the Ministry of Finance. Next slide. Also, you have to be living in the geographic ambits of greater sanitary vulnerability. Why? Because we have a few regions of Peru that haven't been hit by COVID just yet. So you had to be in the areas, urban areas that have, by the Ministry of Health, been deemed to be in greater vulnerability. Next slide. And this is the last factor that was being considered for a household to get the cash grant for independent informal workers, that the expense in electricity every month by the household would not exceed $20 US, because that information is part of this directory that we have of all the households in Peru, which labels them as extreme poor, poor, non-poor. So we are looking at the non-poor, and we do have the number of the electricity registry and the consumption of electricity in the households. This last criteria was not used at the end. That's why I say cancel there. Next slide. Okay, so how were the cash grants paid? Both the one for the poor and the one specifically for workers. You had to go on a website, very simple website, Bono Independiente, in the case of independent workers. You type in your national ID numbers. It tells you if you're a beneficiary. You register your cell phone, and then you get on your cell phone, you get a code. That code is the one that you can take to an ATM or to a teller if you want to go and have face-to-face contact. To the National Bank of Peru, which is the one that pays professors of public schools, all doctors, all people who work for government. And this bank has a presence across the country, everywhere in the most remote areas. So you would get a code and you can go to the ATM machine or you can go to the bank office itself. Next slide.
Yeah. Carmen, I think your time is running out. If you could wrap up in a minute, that would be nice.
Yes. Okay. There was another thing that was issued for food security, and in this case, we consider there was a mistake that the government gave to municipalities, 200 million soles distributed to 1,800 municipalities in the country to buy food baskets and deliver them to the most vulnerable people. What happened with those baskets? 60% of those have not been delivered just yet, and many of them went through raffles, through draws. There's corruption. Sometimes you get half of what you were supposed to get in the basket. So municipal governments were not ready to do this, and it was a mistake of the government to trust that municipal governments could do it. And somehow they also wanted to give the responsibility to local governments and not have that responsibility themselves. Next slide. Oh, this is just something about people who signed up as volunteers. So we are under strict lockdown. We cannot get out. We have the police and the military on the streets. You can get a fine if you leave home, if it's not under strict circumstances to go and shop for food. So 19,000 people signed up to do the follow-up calls to the elderly, to follow up on how they're feeling, how they're doing, especially if they are COVID patients. Next slide. And this is just like an infographic on how the programs were progressing. At the top, you see the one that says number 1, Primer Bono. That's the one for the poor. And you can see that it has reached most of the households that it had as target. Number 2 is the cash grant that I have been speaking about. And you can see that it had the goal of almost 800,000 households. And it had a short progress, half progress in terms of people having gone to cash their grant. And the other ones concern different things. So that's the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Very much, Carmen, for this very very clear and very illustrative description of how the response was being implemented in Peru, and what are the positive points, but also what were the challenges in it. And with that, I'll be happy to hand over to Portia for some as a discussant. And so please, Portia, if you could share your comments with us. We cannot hear you, Portia. Oh.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you so much to Laura and Carmen for very great presentations and those insights. I think they're very useful to help us engage in a fruitful discussion. I think both of you have given us a very good sense of challenges facing informal workers in the wake of COVID-19. Now, the economic impacts highlighted by Laura's presentation can't be disputed at all. And whereas these look at how the sector is generally affected, I think it would have probably been even more useful to just juxtapose those covariant shocks to the idiosyncratic ones, simply because we know that informal workers are considered to be most at risk and are also impacted by this crisis at various levels. These various levels may require different responses, obviously. For instance, at a micro level, when you have a female informal worker who suffers a loss of income and is in an abusive relationship, that presents an even bigger challenge on her hands. And then you've got issues like high virus exposure risk due to lockdown restrictions, also imposing further hardships because most of people in the informal sector would be staying in houses that are very congested because of the numbers and because of the small spaces that they have to share. So, I mean, all of that compounds the shock and the issues at the micro level. So it would have been wonderful to just see, you know, comparatively the different levels and how comparatively those levels compare, so that even when policy responses are mooted, they have to be mooted, keeping in mind those different levels of shocks. And then when we go to slide number 5, that speaks to options that are there within the social protection space and the advantages and the disadvantages. I think statistics would have been very useful to also enable just further interpretation and analysis, because it would also assist for us to consider which options would be best suited for such a crisis. I mean, we all know that this is very unprecedented in our lifetimes. So some kind of, you know, working with numbers and seeing what patterns are beginning to emerge, you know, elsewhere in the world would probably help us to delve deeper and analyze even further. For instance, we've just learned that in Namibia, just very recently, they approved a once-off basic income grant, which they call emergency income grant. And that particular grant in Namibia covers people who are between the ages of 18 and 19 years, 18 and 59 years. And they have to be unemployed, or if not, if employed, then they have to be in the informal sector and be partly unemployed or fully have lost their jobs. And I think the payments have already been disbursed as of the 14th of April. So they were quite quick in responding to the COVID crisis. But the question then becomes, you know, is BIG a silver bullet for a crisis such as this one that we have, or should we start considering, you know, different instruments or even a multiplicity of instruments, given the complexity of the health and the economic calamity that we're sitting with? But then your key messages, Laura, advocate for universality instead of targeted measures. And I think you may even want to go further to speak to the importance of effective delivery mechanisms that are required, you know, whichever route you choose to take as a government or as a society. For example, the question that I would like to personally pose is, I would like to ask you that with what you know already, what do you think would be the opportunities that COVID-19 presents to social protection in relation to the informal sector, and both in terms of the now, but also, you know, for the future, because I think there are learnings that we can derive and be able to implement. And then just moving swiftly to Carmen, because I'm very mindful of time. I really appreciate the short summary that you have provided on the demographics, as well as the economic and social statistics, because I think they help us to frame the discussion accordingly. And then your presentation brings to bear the high number of people who constitute the informal economy. This shouldn't come as a surprise, because we are all aware that this is the case in many countries, in many parts of the world. So it also makes us realize the huge and likely catastrophic implications of policy inaction because of the sheer numbers that we have in the informal sector, but also the implications, at the macroeconomic level, if we do not act swiftly. I was particularly drawn to the distribution of informal workers in one of your slides, the different categories, as well as the profiles. And I was just wondering that, given, because in Peru, you've got more people in non-agriculture within the informal sector. And I was just wondering if you'd have the same situation as in South Africa now, where some economists are beginning to suggest that one sector that will experience growth due to COVID-19 is actually agriculture, due to food production demand increases, as well as for food security reasons. So I'm just keen to know if Peru would possibly want to zoom into that particular space, into that industry, and see if there are possibilities of shifts within industries, from one industry to another within the informal economy, just so that we can buffer the people who are in that space. But then both presentations have underscored the centrality of social protection to cushion informal workers. And they also highlight the fact that this sector is not homogeneous. I think Laura also mentioned that earlier on. And I couldn't agree more with those assertions. I do believe, however, that as social scientists, we have the burden to prove and to illustrate our statements with hard statistical data, which will support theoretical points that we make. And I think that is very important, because it will go a long way to bolster our arguments, especially where buy-in is crucial and it is so necessary. And then lastly, Carmen, maybe you can tell us more about the importance of data validity and of having effective information systems in place that will enable us to know where the informal workers are, how to reach those informal workers, and how fast they can be reachable. Because it is important that we realize that the informal sector has long been shut out of the mainstream economy in many ways, in terms of making sure that we've got them properly recorded and we have them properly structured, so that for monitoring and evaluation purposes, we are able to know what is going on in that space, but also so that in times like this, where there are interventions that are required, both economically and socially, we can have targeted interventions that will not exclude most of them, simply because we do not have enough information and data in place. So I would just love to have your thoughts about the extent to which you think that it is important, especially in the case of Peru. At some point, I think another conversation that will have to be had is around the migrant workers, because we all know that there is a lot of labor mobility that happens, labor migration. And in most cases, these migrants are in the informal sector. But then, even in scenarios where all of a sudden the prevailing circumstances imposes on countries and governments to do something about ameliorating, the hard impacts of a crisis such as COVID, you find that the migrant workers are going to be left out simply because they are not on any registry, they are not on any national identification system, and they are regarded as the other. So when we have a conversation like this one, I think that having understood that this is not a homogeneous group, that part of the segment within this sector is that of migrant workers, and what policy options and policy responses do we think that we can bring across in order to ensure that no one is left behind in this process? And I thought that I should quickly just also tell you about some measures that South Africa is taking in trying to respond to the plight of informal workers. The country has basically decided to deploy a combination of 3 arrangements. First, in the informal space, the informal arrangements that are being encouraged are such that through social media, through the mainstream media, televisions, etc., people are actually being encouraged from all ends to please, those who are able to please make sure that they take those who are suffering, who are struggling as a result of this pandemic under their wing and extend, you know, a hand of support one way or the other, financially or otherwise. But also we're looking at market-based arrangements where especially banks have decided to come up with very innovative ways like bringing about debt repayments, holidays for not only small enterprises and big enterprises, but also for some people who are hardest hit by this pandemic, as well as bringing about interest-free loans for a period. Some would say 4 months, 6 months, 9 months. It would depend on the bank with which you are. So those are some of the provisions that the banks are providing, but also within the public arrangements. Very recently, our Minister of Finance is on record having said that the introduction of basic income grant is an option that is presently on the table and it's under consideration. So you'd see that there are serious considerations for both vertical and horizontal expansions, and they are all being discussed currently within cabinet. But there is a serious public outcry out there because people feel that generally, although there is a lot of talk about this, there is a solidarity fund that has been established through the private sector and people are pumping in a lot of money in there. But in practical, the money is not going through at the speed and agency that people were expecting. So people who are mostly affected feel that they are most likely to suffer even longer term consequences due to very slow and delayed responses from government. So I think those are some of the lessons that we need to derive there to say that when you've got an emergency, you need to have a sense of agency in responding to that. And then in summary, really, I want to say that I've enjoyed this presentation so much, and I think that they provide us with good building blocks on which to layer further empirical work on how to use social protection in a more responsive and preventative way so that we can ameliorate the adverse impacts of such shocks in future. I'm going to pause here because I'm mindful of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Portia. And we have also enjoyed your comments very much. We're very, very, thank you very much. And no, thank you. That was kind of really kind of opening a lot of points for discussion. And we've been following also the discussion, the questions that will come from all those who are following the discussion. So, I mean, we have 11 minutes left. So, what I would suggest now, I will try to maybe just highlight some of the points that came out from several participants in the discussion. Really cluster them together in three different clusters of questions, and I think this also resonates quite a lot with Portia's comments. And I think both Laura and Carmen have a lot to say on these. And Portia, if you want to come in at the end, I think that would be also very, very welcome. So, but I would really like you then to be very concise in your answers, just being mindful about the time. So I think the first cluster of questions that I would like to highlight from the questions that have come in was really around the question of outreach and how to best locate, register informal workers, how to find a good way of bringing the benefits to them, to reach them. And I think both in Laura's and in Carmen's presentation, this has come out very, very clearly. So there was a question from Jorge Ruiz Torres, now from Ruby Khan, on how to best locate and register informal workers. And Jorge Ruiz Torres had a specific question on Mexico in that context. And I would also like to link in a comment which was made by Valentina Barca regarding the targeting out, also highlighting the example of Bolivia. And that is what you have seen in the chat box. And bring in another question that comes from Florencia Alejandre on how do you do targeting out within countries with low systems capacities. So that's all a very kind of a first cluster of questions, but I think I would like to just introduce also the two others so that you can then respond to all of them at once, just because we don't have so much time left. So the second cluster of questions was around the impact on women and the gender sensitivity, not just with regard to the program design, but also with regard to the delivery mechanism. So, for example, if the expectation is that it would be mostly women to go and collect the benefits, I mean, how can these be structured in a way which is gender sensitive and gender responsive? And I'm just trying to find the question to see from, and yeah, it was from Patricia Veloso Cavallari. So I think that's also a very important set of questions. And maybe if I can bring in another aspect to it, which was also mentioned by others, which was specifically looking at migrant workers. And so this is a bit of a deviation to the question, but I think it's also an important point. And this was being mentioned by Abidemi Coker, and with a specific focus on remittances also from Victor Juarez. So this is a kind of a question 2A, 2B. And finally, the last cluster of questions that I would like to highlight here. But as I said at the beginning, we will have the opportunity also to respond to more questions in writing afterwards. The third cluster of questions is really on the opportunities emerging at a macro level. To what extent this would really, all this work, all the now this outreach, to what extent this could really support then also the transitions from the informal to the formal economy. And that question was asked by Katyanan Sharma with a reference specifically to India. But there was also a follow-up question then from Paul Tulloch, whether this could be an opportunity to move towards a kind of a post-Keynesian response to economic development that also puts a much stronger focus on the protection of workers in different contexts. So I know this is a very a long list, so please feel free to pick out what you would like to focus on. So maybe if you can start with Laura again, and if you could, each of you, just kind of reply in 2 minutes, because this is the time we have left. So handing over to Laura.
Thanks, Christina. That was a magnificent job in categorizing those questions. I'm not going to be able to really give a solid answer to any of those in the time available. So I'm going to promise, though, to provide answers in writing to those questions that come to me. I think there definitely are answers to gender sensitivity and delivery. I think there's a lot of learning to be had from the cash grants, social assistance literature, even the social insurance literature about, you know, small tweaks that you can make to make things easier for women. One thing I did want to say about women and complementary programming that I left out of an earlier slide was that one of the policy implications is going to be around care support for essential workers who are experiencing care burdens in the informal economy. And so that is either around, provision of some kind of childcare facilities, and that might be difficult in the current situation, but also financial support for care responsibility. So I wanted to add that as well. I think I agree that there are, and perhaps just to say, I agree that there are big questions that are coming out about what the macro picture is. I think it's important actually that we keep the microeconomic picture of what's happening to livelihoods on the ground and the macroeconomic visions. I think that an important job is going to be bringing those together, and how we keep that detailed focus on what's happening to different sectors in the informal economy, and then thinking about what does that mean for the bigger macro picture. And I think that's very much part of the formalization, and do we move to Keynesianism? And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that in writing. Thanks, Christina.
Oh, thank you so much, and especially also thanks for being so brief and concise, and for your promise to contribute also to the response to the question in writing. So that puts a big challenge on you, Carmen, for the response, and then afterwards I would kind of just briefly hand over to Portia for a last word. Your microphone is on mute, Carmen.
Thank you. So very specifically on migrant workers, here are the ones that are considered our Venezuelan workers. As much as advocacy they didn't get any support. In terms of how the independent informal worker cash grant that I described and how it had been arrived to, the list of the beneficiaries, how did it go? From the networks that we have of organizations of informal workers, we know only of 5 people who got it in Lima, domestic workers, and 27 people who got it in the province of Arequipa, in the south of Peru, 27 people, domestic workers. So we don't know if maybe the workers are not saying if they got it because they don't want to say that they got that support because they always want to be advocating for more support, or if truly the listing from government of those labeled not poor really has that voluntary component, in the sense that it was not sweeping the city and tagging every household as poor, extreme poor, or not poor, but that in the portion of the not poor, they had a lot of people coming to register and saying, we want you to assess our household because we want to have access to free insurance in health. So if a lot of the people who are in the directory were voluntary people who asked to be assessed, then that would be the reason why we are getting so many workers who didn't get any support whatsoever. So right now the situation is that we are advocating, we have advocated for a long time now. It feels long, maybe it hasn't been long in terms of time, but to extend that cash grant of independent workers to more people with the lists that we have been able to collect. So we have about 10,000 people listed between newspaper vendors, street vendors, domestic workers, moto taxi drivers, like rickshaw drivers, market workers, market porters, all kinds of workers. And they keep telling us that it's not official data and that's why they cannot use it. So we are advocating now for when the lockdown finishes next Monday, supposed to be finished next Monday, that these people are allowed to go out to work. And we actually have a campaign going on right now on social media stating the main problems of these sectors of work and what they need at this point. And it's mostly access to be able to work jointly with the police and the military to maintain order in the places of selling products, even if it's on the streets or in markets, to avoid, many people getting together. And yeah, it's basically that, to have the chance to go back to work, even if it is for 2-3 hours in the morning.
Yeah.
In terms of
okay, thanks. Sorry, we have to wrap up, and Very brief last word to Portia, please.
Okay, just a quick one. I'm just going to zoom into the issue about transition from informal to formal, to say that in South Africa, actually, we're using this opportunity to do exactly that. In a sense that I think Laura initially made reference to the unemployment insurance fund that you can only tap into there if you are contributing and you are compliant. So we're using this opportunity to say those employers, the SMMEs who have not been contributing to the unemployment insurance fund, can come and get debt relief for working capital from our department, small business development. However, we do dangle a carrot and say, we are only going to help you if you show us evidence that you at least went online to register for UIF, so that in future we know that the system has captured you, and then you'll continue to contribute beyond COVID. And similarly with SARS. So I think we are going to make very good progress in that regard, because we are taking the posture that says we are not going to waste a good crisis as a government. And then also just to say that, you know, in the Transform family, we are very big on mind shifts and transformative approaches. And we cannot think of a better time than now for us to be able to think creatively, to use the opportunity to innovate by way of program design, systems and processes. So we are definitely trying to ramp up to make sure that we are going to bring as many of the so-called informal into the fold, so that when the next crisis hits, we have a different picture to speak to. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that was an excellent last word that really keeps us also really going and thinking about a better way for the future. So thank you very much to all three of you, and thank you very much to everyone who was listening and contributing by questions. So we're going to follow up on the questions of answers in writing. So you're going to see that. And I would also like to again remind you about the next webinar and invite you to participate as actively in that one. It is on 28th of April, and it's on impacts of the COVID crisis on formal sector workers and potential social protection employment responses. And I think this is very much also has to do with the topic of this webinar, because what we really should strive for is that everyone has access to social protection independently, and I mean for workers in all forms of employment, including the self-employed workers, and also extending to those in the informal economy. So thank you very much to everyone. It has been a pleasure to be with us, and please make sure you answer also the webinar survey. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar or in the online community. So have a good day, evening, good night, and looking forward to seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thanks to all the speakers especially, and to all those who have organized it. Thank you very much.
Yes.